right. Welcome everybody. If you are just joining us, we're going to get started here in just a couple seconds. We'll give everyone a little bit of time to find the stream. But we are very excited today to talk with Chris Mullins a little bit about season extenders. So we'll just get started here in about 30 seconds or a minute. All right, it looks like we have a couple people with us. So let's go ahead and get started here. Thank you for joining us today. We have Chris Mullins of VSU, and he's going to talk about extending your growing season into the fall and even the winter, depending on where you are in Virginia. You can see how far you can keep growing your kale and broccoli into the winter. Next week is going to be the last video that we're going to do for the season in our beginning gardening series. And we're going to talk a little bit about indoor plants and indoor plant propagation with Kathleen Reed, who is the state coordinator for the Master Gardener Program. So she's also going to talk a little bit about what the Master Gardener Program is and how you can get involved or reach out for help if you need more questions about gardening answered. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
All right. Thank you, Devin. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here today. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk a little bit with you all. And we're not going to spend a long time on this, but as you're in this Beginning Gardener series, we're thinking about all kinds of tools and tricks and things with gardening, with vegetable gardening. So one of those is maybe how to extend your growing season a little bit, maybe into the fall, which we're approaching, and into the winter time. And then in the spring, so we'll touch on some of that. And so we'll spend the next little bit. I've got some slides. I've got a few videos I wanted to show because it's always, when we're doing this when we're in this PowerPoint world and we're not outside necessarily, it's good to be able to maybe see some things that are outside. So we've got a few videos I'm going to show. But let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about a few different ways that you, as a gardener, can extend your growing season. And really, season extension just means it refers to anything that allows a crop to be cultivated outside of its norm, outside of its normal growing season. And so then you have to kind of think about a little, in a way, what is our normal growing season? And that's going to be different for just about everybody that's out there. But when we think about the state of Virginia anyway, we have different hardiness zones, USDA hardiness zones. And if you look at a few of them here, Tidewater and the Piedmont area, what I've listed here are a few of the last killing frost dates, first killing frost dates. And these are the ones, a killing frost is usually thought of as temperatures below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That especially with warm season annuals is going to kill them. Now there's also obviously more cool season crops like Swiss chard and lettuce and kale and all the brassicas that are probably going to survive past that. But with a little bit of protection in the fall and going into the winter time, they can do very well. But I think it's very important to look at your growing conditions wherever you are, whether you're in the mountains of Virginia and you're maybe all the way out in Dickinson County, or you're in Pungo near Virginia Beach. It's a little different. So what I wanted to do really quickly is go to a really nice publication that we have at the Virginia Tech Master Gardener vegetable gardening website, and I'll give you that link at the end. But I'm assuming you can all see this, and this is the Virginia Home Garden Vegetable Planting Guide, and this looks at different crops, various crops, and when they might be planted based on the hardiness zone. So if you look at this map of Virginia, we've got lots of squiggly lines, lots of delineations here. And it looks like Virginia has a lot of zones, and it does. It has three basic ones. Then it has where there's elevation and other things. It's got some some others. So if you think about if you live in Cumberland County, Virginia, which is going to be in zone 7A, we're going to go through these next pages just real quickly to show you. If you look here on the left-hand page, this is recommended planting dates and harvest dates for that 7A hardiness zone. And if you take something like Chinese cabbage, for example, you'll see that on this list, the X's denote when to plant, the O's tell you when to harvest, or when you should be harvesting. And so there's usually one for the spring and one for the fall. You can kind of see what those dates are. So I guess the point I want to make is that in this publication, which you can find online, and again, I'll show you the resource, how to get to it later. This does a good job of looking at Virginia, where many of you are, and trying to figure out when to plant. Of course, when we think about these season extension technologies that we're going to be talking about, like row covers and cold frames and hot caps, this is going to maybe in the fall, maybe give us a little bit later time to plant. And it's also possibly going to be extending that growing season a little bit further. So Chinese cabbage, instead of maybe kind of maybe harvesting towards the end of November being the final date, it might be 2 or 3 weeks later. So as we'll go back to the PowerPoint now, but I guess the idea here is just to think about where you're located, what the historical frost dates have been, and kind of will help you plan as you're thinking about your garden and season extension. So what kind of crops would you be growing that you might need some type of protection, or you might want to maybe extend the growing season on, or grow into the fall or earliness in the spring? Many crops can benefit from protection, because what we have is we create, with a lot of these protection devices, we create a little microclimate around the plant that's usually favorable. It's usually a little warmer. And so it's going to help a lot of crops. These cold weather crops that we're thinking about, and Devin mentioned kale, as we're thinking about kale or even spinach going into the fall, having some type of protection is just going to push that further and further, that we'll be able to harvest that. And then we think about a lot of times in the springtime, going into the summer, some of these fruiting crops, tomatoes and peppers, for example, eggplant, squash, they can benefit from having some type of protection, to maybe even protect from insects, but really to kind of help create a really favorable environment early on. So as we go through here, we're going to think about some ways that you can extend the growing season, and things like row covers, cold frames, caps or domes, even mulch can be used to extend the growing season. If you think about even the picture at the bottom right with a lot of straw, it happens to be in a high tunnel, but without the high tunnel, even a lot of straw will help protect against some little bit of cold weather. And black plastic, as you see large commercial growers use black plastic mulch and plant into that black plastic warms the ground up. And so that can even give you some season extension, some earliness. Even as that ground, the root zone area is warmer, you might be able to plant a little earlier. And also, ways to extend the growing season are going to be high tunnels and greenhouses. And we're not going to talk too much about that, but those are definite ways that if you have those tools, you can grow out of season. So let's just spend a few minutes talking about row covers. I think probably this is going to be one of the most important ways that you can extend the growing season. There's a few others, but these can be very effective for the home gardener. And you see various pictures here of different types of fabric, what looks like fabric to you probably. And you see some just laying on the ground. You see some with hoops. And generally they can be either way. So the bottom picture that's actually in a high tunnel, just kind of excuse that greenhouse look to it. But even on bare ground, that's a floating row cover. So that's going to cover something that doesn't really, it doesn't matter so much if the growing tip is touching or being squished by the plastic, like tomatoes and and peppers, which really wouldn't do well with a floating row cover, but they would do well with a hooped row cover. So if you look at the top two pictures, you'll see some type of hoop, wire or conduit or PVC that can be used to keep that frost protection fabric, whatever it is, from really pushing down on the crop. So these row covers in general are going to provide a fair amount of protection depending on what you use to cover it with, material wise. They can provide a fair amount, as much as 10 degrees potentially, from ambient temperature, from the regular air temperature outside. They also might protect from insects. Many of you probably have heard of that flea beetles attack. This is always a good example. Flea beetles attack eggplant in early springtime. Having a row cover over your eggplant can really benefit from excluding the flea beetles and also creating that favorable microclimate, which really pushes them forward and gives you earliness in the for that crop. So these row covers are, like I said, are going to have various types of construction material. Even the hoops are going to be made out of different things, and there's several different ones. And the material that you cover it with is going to be a little different. So what I kind of wanted to show here with this little table is some of the material might look like this. And usually the row cover, the frost protection fabric, you might see it called Rime or Agribon, which are kind of trade names. This material is usually, looks kind of like a polyester. They call it a spun-bound polypropylene fiber. And it's you can see that air can be transmitted through it, but it does a nice job of letting air in, letting water in, but also kind of keeping some of that air in and keeping it warm in there. And the way that this is graded or sold is by the weight. So it's kind of like the thickness or heaviness of the material. So usually the heavier that this is, the more protection you're going to get. So if you look at the top heading where it says weight per square yard, and then next column is the amount of protection it might provide. And then it also shows light transmission. So you can kind of see how it gets thicker and less light is being transmitted. So the lightweight material, which is about a little over 1/2 ounce per square yard, is going to be good for, for this particular manufacturer, down to 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty good. And then when you get to the heavier material down at the bottom, the 1.8 ounce per square yard can protect even further, but you'll see light transmission is a lot less. So it just varies on what you're going to use here. But there are different types, is kind of what I wanted to illustrate here. And there's lots of different vendors for this type of material. One thing about the frost protection fabric is it needs to have a way to ventilate or cool down, because you can, in the spring, get too much, or potentially even in the fall, too much heat in there. And so the nice thing about this polypropylene material is that it kind of vents itself very easily. Now, if you look at the picture, and you can use just plain polyethylene plastic, like the picture that's on the left top, but remember, it has to be vented in some way, sometimes with slits or sometimes by opening the ends. And you'll notice that both of those pictures have a type of hooped material that this is either the plastic or the Agribon is pulled over. And you'll notice that bottom picture, it is being vented in that picture. So it's gotten pretty warm in there. All right, so there's different types of materials that you could use to cover as a row cover. The most common are going to be this Rime Agribon material, which you can get from various vendors. And I'll show you a website in a little bit that has some of these. And there's lots of vendors out there. The other one might be plastic. So just some things to think about when you're using row covers. And you see the pictures here of what they might look like, with some floating row covers on the bottom right, and then hooped on the other two pictures. This material can be reused, and it varies in cost, anywhere from 45 cents to about 55 cents a square yard. So there is a cost there. And so it's good that you can use these for at least 2 or 3 seasons. But you've got to be careful. They are, the thinner it is, the easier it is to tear. And the material anyway is kind of easy to tear. I would use sharp scissors with these when you're cutting them to length or cutting them to width. Just the material, a knife, unless it's a very sharp knife, knives tend to tear it. So sharp scissors would be a good choice. Make sure when you're putting this down that it's secured properly. On the video in a little bit, we're going to show you how one way to secure it with ground staples, but there are other ways where you can put weights like bricks or stones or sandbags or something like that on them to hold them down. You want to think about venting if necessary. So there is some management involved. You can leave these on for an extended period of time, but you really need to watch and make sure that it's not getting too hot in there. The other thing to think about is that if you do get trapped insect populations in there, this creates a perfect environment for them with lots of food and lots of good temperature and humidity. So if you do have trapped pest populations, it can be an issue. In the springtime, you do want to think about if it's flowering and needs pollination, that you want to, remove it, the cover for at least 4 or 5, 6 hours during the day, the middle of the day, for pollination to occur from insects. And remembering too that the heavier the fabric is, the more shade it's going to provide. And the plants don't need a whole lot of shade, so that's one thing you're giving up there. You can still get weeds in these, especially in the springtime. You can get weed growth in there. There are going to be weed seeds that are almost ubiquitous that are going to be around and will germinate in the springtime. You don't see it as much in the fall because those annual weed seeds that are at the surface there, because it's getting so cold towards the end of the season, they don't have as much vigor. So you generally have a pretty clean bed from weeds in the fall. So anyway, and the other thing, make sure you store it carefully, because this is something you've invested in. You want to try to keep it. It can get a little dirty and it can have rips in it. But if you're careful with the way that you wind it up and store it, it can last you for a little while anyway. Let me show you a quick video here of some, let's see. And we'll look at some row covers and how they're being utilized.
Well, hello and welcome. Today we're at Fauquier Education Farm. We're here with Mr. Jim Hankins, the Executive Director here. Thanks, Jim, for letting us come out here today. We're going to be talking about row covers, and that's not just for commercial growers, but the home gardeners can use that also, can't they?
Row covers are one of the most beneficial things you can do for a really, really wide variety of vegetable crops that you might have in your garden.
Okay.
This year we have row covers on Chinese cabbage, broccoli, eggplant, cucumbers, cantaloupe,
Quite a variety.
Quite a wide variety of stuff. We are familiar with using them in spring and fall for season extension,
Okay.
to protect from frost.
Right.
This time of year, they're outstanding for insect protection. It is a white fabric that insects just cannot go through.
Okay.
Like right here behind me, I've got eggplant.
Okay.
So many of us have set out nice little eggplant transplants, and within the first week, flea beetles will just destroy them.
Right.
So these were set out. I did spray them one time and cover them up,
Okay.
and I will leave that covered until it's a big, robust plant and is starting to pollinate.
Okay.
I'll have to uncover it at that point so that the pollinators can get to the blossoms. But at that point, it's a big, healthy, vigorous plant,
Okay.
and it can take the flea beetle pressure.
That makes sense. Now, do they get too hot under there, or is it a good climate for them under there?
It's an outstanding microclimate underneath the row cover. It has so many more benefits than just that insect protection. A day like today, the sun is mighty bright out here.
Right.
So it is protecting these plants with just a little bit of shade. They get plenty of sun.
Okay.
But it is protecting from the worst, most harsh part of the UV rays. It's protecting from wind. It is reducing the transpiration that happens with the plants, where they're having to suck up a lot of water from the ground just to put it back into the air. This helps reduce that. It reduces the plant stress, and they love it under there.
That is great. So you got eggplants. Let's look at these. Let's take this back and see what they look like.
And it's just held down with these simple little, they're called sod staples. There's nothing too magical about it. These have not been out there very long. But without protection, these little eggplant, which have only been in a week,
right,
but without protection, they'd already be covered with flea beetles.
This whole structure that you've got here, and you've got long rows of it, how do you put it together? Is it easy? Is it inexpensive? How expensive? How do you put it together?
It's really, really simple. I buy these pre-bent wire hoops. You can get them in a lot of seed catalogs, most of the major seed catalogs, you know. You can buy straight pieces of wire and bend them yourself. It's just to keep the fabric up off of the plant.
Okay. How far apart are they? Do you place those generally?
I've got them about 8 feet. You know, I have a lot of wire hoops. You don't want it way too infrequent, so it's sagging.
Okay.
But there's no real science to it, you know. Okay. And then you put the fabric over top. It is really well worth saying that the fabric on the edges has no strength. Mm-hmm. You know, you can pull right through it.
I see, okay.
So what I always do is where I'm putting the staples in, I just roll the fabric a little bit.
Okay.
And then
right in there. And then
right
if you keep this kind of tight, it's gonna...
Yep, and you know, if we get one down here, and don't put one into my irrigation tubing.
That's right.
And that's really all it is. It's not rocket science, but it makes a really significant difference.
Well, wonderful. I think this has a lot of potential for home gardeners.
Yep.
Well, thanks, Jim, again for letting us come out here today and talk to you about this. Well, for more information about row covers, contact your local county extension office and talk to a master gardener.
All right.
For From
So
the Ground Up, I'm Chris Mullins. We'll see you next time.
What that fabric might look like and how those hoops might be. And those are 9 or 10 gauge wire hoops, and you can use other material like just small PVC plastic pipe or EMT or electrical conduit. And then you can find vendors like just this one online. There's lots of them if you Google, and there's even local companies that would sell these in garden centers. But you can see the different types of material here and the various accessories that go along with them. So that kind of gives you a good idea of what the row covers are about very quickly, but it can be very effective. And one of the probably the more effective things of what we'll talk about today in terms of extending your growing season, whether it's into the fall or just earliness in the spring. I will mention domes or caps here that many people maybe have used over the years, and there are some different types of domes or caps or cloches that you could use, and they're especially well adapted to a small garden. But this is going to be something placed over individual plants as opposed to the row covering that we saw a minute ago. And many of you have maybe tried this, like the picture on the bottom left with the milk jugs, that the bottom's cut out and the cap can be on or can be screwed off to ventilate. Kind of a neat thought here. And you know, originally when we think about early gardeners in Europe and in France, they use these glass cloches that you see a picture of there in the center. And I'll show you some of those in a video in just a second. And one I want to mention is this Wall of Water is one trade name, but there are others out there. And you can kind of see a picture of at the bottom right and even at the top right after the tomatoes have grown through them. This is a plastic round item that's got cells in it basically, and those cells you can fill with water. And I hope you can see that in the bottom picture. There's water there, and it surrounds an individual plant. In this case, a tomato plant in the springtime that's been transplanted into the ground there. You can't tell, but that wall of water, or whatever you want to call it, it forms kind of a teepee. And as the plant goes through it, it kind of opens up and allows the plant to grow through it. But if you consider milk jugs or big, large water bottles, they're not that thick in the material that you use, and you would expect you don't get a lot of protection. But you probably all know that water has a fair amount of insulating value. And so the idea of this wall of water around the plant, protecting probably 4, 5, 6 degrees from outside temperature can be a really nice thing to use. So again, domes or hot caps can have a lot of potential for some of you, especially those with smaller gardens. And maybe potentially even with containers, pots and things like that. One of the things we want to think about with containers that you're trying to push the growing season with is that root ball. You want to keep that a little warm too and insulated. I will mention that even with the milk jugs, you can cut this so that there are tabs there, and you can put staples or nails through it so that they'll stay down and won't get blown off by the wind. But compared maybe to row covers, these might not give as much protection as some of the heavyweight fabric, but they can do a good job for many of you. And you can find things that are commercially available, like that picture on the bottom. So you can imagine you would buy that. It's got a little venting tab on the top. Now, there is not a lot of air movement like with the Rime or Agribond type fabric that you have. So you've got to be a little more careful with the way that you use these. I will show you a video right now that does show some of these cloches, and I'd like to bear with it. It's a little bit about tools at the beginning of the video, but hopefully we'll get to see these colonial coverings.
Well, hello and welcome. Today we're in Colonial Williamsburg, and we're talking about historic gardening tools. We're here with Miss Eve Otmar. Eve is the historic trades gardener here at Colonial Williamsburg. Thanks for letting us be here today and talk to you about some of these tools. Well, thank you very much. Tell me, what are some of these tools you've got here?
So this time of year, we're turning soil, getting ready for the winter garden. Okay. So our workhorses are the spades. And then you're turning the garden beds shortly thereafter. Right. You're using a hoe, and you want to use the largest hoe you have to really break up the clods. Sure. Help form your ridges if you're going to have ridges. And then shortly thereafter, you follow with a nice rake. Right. You want to find any of the little clods you haven't gotten, and you can actually use it this way, right, and then to smooth the bed to make it perfect, you turn it
nice and flat with the backside. That makes perfect sense. I see you've got some other things, some pruners here. Wow, those things are heavy.
Yeah. So you can skip going to the gym. Yeah. This is from iron and made out of wood handles, okay, but it does a really great job. You know, the only difference between tools then and now is kind of the materials.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. Yeah. That makes sense because a lot of these things just seem very similar. Even these pruners. Right?
Those are very nice. These are blacksmith made here in town, and they do the same thing they did back then, just a little differently.
That's
a little different engineering.
That's great. Well, I know there's some other practices and things we might go over there and see right now.
All right. If you'd like, we go on up and take a look.
All right. Well, Eve, this is a great garden you've got here. Tell me about it.
All right, so this is our winter garden, and all those tools we just talked about, right, we used those just yesterday. So we turned the entire bed with the spades, then we went ahead and raked or hoed, right, and then we used the rake to shape all of our ridges here. And then we planted this morning So that's why some of these don't look so great, but that's also why we use these bell jars over the top of them. Helps kind of help them along and get acclimated to being in the ground.
So that's something that we'd find nowadays, something like a hot cap or something to protect the plants from cooler temperatures.
And bell jar or cloche is the term for that tool.
Okay.
So these are winter hardy, which means they have a higher level of sugar in their system.
Okay.
So kohlrabi, we have collards here, and there's broccoli and cauliflower. There's chard in the middle, and we have a few cabbages out on the edge.
Well, that's excellent. This really looks great.
It'll look better in a couple of weeks, but
well, it's amazing really to look at all the tools from that era and seeing that they're very similar to what we have today.
Yes.
I really appreciate you letting us come out and see some of these things you're doing here today.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, for more information about tools like this or the gardens in Colonial Williamsburg, go to colonialwilliamsburg.com. From the ground up, I'm Chris Mullins.
Kind of give you an idea of what those glass jars, bell jars, cloches look like from many years ago. The last thing I wanted to touch on when we think about season extension for the home gardener is going to be a cold frame type of setup. And these are, like the picture you see here, can be built in various ways with various materials. A cold frame is usually thought of as something like that is in the picture there, where there's no added heat to it. Sometimes, and we'll also call something like this a hot frame, where there's maybe some input of heat, whether that's with a electrical source, and you might have a heating pad or electrical coils running through the ground that's in this. And this would be built on the ground with soil as a base. Or even those hot frames might have a layer would be soil, a layer of manure, and another layer of soil. And that would be more short-term producing heat, but that manure would, as it decomposes through the bacterial action, you would have heat given off. This is especially good in the springtime for hardening off plants, but it certainly could be used in the fall to grow plants in. And the picture you see there are some transplants in there, so it's really good for that. Usually you would build this so that it faces the southerly direction, so the southern sun is going to warm this up. And this is something that needs to be vented, and as you can see here, it's vented completely right here in the picture. But it also could be those pieces of glass, those frames of glass, can be brought back down when it's cooler. Let me do this. I'll show you one last video. When we talk about, I put together a cold frame out of recycled material a while back, and just kind of show you how easy it would be to build something fairly simple as a cold frame.
Well, hi and welcome. Today we're at Virginia State University's Randolph Farm, and we're going to be talking about cold frames. Now, what is a cold frame? A cold frame is basically just a structure that you can use in your garden to extend your growing season. It's something that you might have earlier in the spring to put transplants in to harden them off, or maybe to have plants growing. It might be something that you might have in the fall or even all the way through the winter time. And it might look a lot like this. It's just something that you might build that's got a top on it that lets light come through so you can grow your plants. And this is one that I put together pretty quick. It's made out of mostly just repurposed materials. There's pallet material here. This is just where a pallet's been taken apart and we just used that lumber. There's some old decking boards that are up there that somebody gave me that we've used, some old plywood type material here, and then this is just a storm window, something that we had laying around, wasn't being used anymore, and it's really nice for a structure like this, and you can actually just open it up pretty easily. So this is what you would use to ventilate the structure. You just open it up like this or close it when it gets too cold out. So let me finish putting this together, and then we'll show you how you would actually use this in the field. Well, one of the things you want to do is make sure when you're siting this to face it south. That way you get maximum sunlight, especially in the colder part of the year. Also, you want a little bit of an angle on your cold frame with the glass, the top part anyway, so that you get maximum sunlight, but you also have things like rain and snow will kind of roll off there. So once you've got this built, then you've got to put your plants in there, and you have to think about management. On a cloudy day like today, it's in the 40s, this would mostly be closed all day long to make sure that the plants are okay. But if it's bright outside, if there's any sun, even on a cold day, you want to vent this. You know, this one you just move the window and close it. Others you would do it in different ways. Well, especially in the springtime, as you're thinking about putting your transplants out into the garden, you might want to harden them off first. Get them out in the cold weather, in the wind, and the sunlight, and make sure that they're ready for the garden. And one of the ways you can do that is put it in the cold frame, keep them warm at night. And one of the ways you can kind of keep this warm, other than just closing and opening the vents, you could add maybe insulation board, something like this, that you could put in here, line the box with it, and maybe even a little bit into the ground to kind of keep it a little warm. Another way you can do that is maybe with a milk jug, painting it black, putting water in it, putting a few of these in here. As they absorb heat during the day, it'll release that heat during night and maybe keep it a little warmer in there. Well, for more information about how to build one of these, or really how to manage a cold frame, contact your local county extension office and talk to a master gardener.
All right.
From the ground up, I'm Chris Mullins.
That was just a real simple, very, very basic cold frame that I literally put together in just a couple hours out of a pallet and some other material I found around the house. But if we think of the major ways that a home gardener, I think, is going to do well with season extension, row covers especially, maybe domes or hot caps, and then maybe some type of cold frame. Looking at these kind of things, and also remembering that it's real important to look at the crops that you select and the time of the year that you're going to be planting those based on where you're at and the historical lows and highs in those areas. There are some resources here I'd like you to think about. One is one that Devon's did a great job of putting together. It's a landing page for home vegetables on the Master Gardener, Virginia Tech Master Gardener website. And you'll find, and there's a picture of it there in the center bottom, pretty easy to get to, even if you don't remember this address. If you Google home vegetable gardening in Virginia Tech or Virginia Cooperative Extension, you're going to find that. And that's going to be a good resource for publications and information on when to plant, what to plant, based on the time of the year. Very good resource right there. A couple books I mentioned is one by Elliott Coleman, Four Season Harvest. Excellent book when we think about season extension. And the same thing, even though that Pam Dalling wrote this about hoop houses and high tunnels, it's worth thinking about just in general. A great book with lots of practical information in that. And there's also other various things you'll find on the internet. SARE is a great repository for information about lots of things, and season extension techniques is going to be one that you'd find in that at that website, that address there. So with that very quick introduction to season extension, I'm going to end there, and I want to thank you for your attention today. And if there's any questions, I'll do my best to answer them right now.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was awesome. I learned a whole lot, and hopefully everybody watching did too. We have a couple really good questions. If anybody else has questions, you can type them in the comments, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So the first, just kind of a technical question, what month was that first video with the eggplant and the flea beetles shot?
Right, so that was taped, I'm trying to remember because it's been a year or two since we taped that. It was early spring, and it was probably in April, probably in late March or April that we taped that. Yeah, that was in Warrenton, Virginia, Fauquier County. So it's a little further north than we are in Richmond and Petersburg, but that was about the time that was taped.
And then another question about that video, it looked like there was some hay on the ground and some black plastic. Was that also there for insulation, or was there another reason?
Sure. So that video where with the row covers were on top of beds that were covered with woven ground cover. So at that particular farm, that's the Fauquier Education Farm, Jim Hankins there, who runs it, he likes to use a lot of woven ground cover, and it's a fairly long-lived material. It's not exactly like black plastic in that it's woven and allows air to move and water to move through it. So it really is a very good material for weed control, but it also can help a little bit with warming, soil warming there. So, so Jim had a couple ways to try to extend his or try to have earliness there. He had those hooped row covers, and the black material on the ground helps with soil warming.
Awesome. And then another question. So what role do row covers have in organic gardening?
Okay. Well, I think they have a good role in organic gardening. A lot of times when we think about organic practices or even varieties that you might see, heirloom varieties in an organic situation, having that protection there can really help. Protection from insects and protection from adverse weather conditions. So I think you'll find in any type of farming operation, whether it's a large scale farming operation or a small scale non-organic or a small scale organic operation, you're going to see some of these tools, and we'll call them tools really, that are being utilized by those particular growers and farmers.
All right, and we have a couple comments about the glass cloches. So someone asked if you have any more information on using them, if you happen to own some already. And then a few people have pointed out very correctly that they're very expensive if you go to buy a glass cloche. And so do you have maybe a more affordable alternative for people?
Well, the ones that were in the picture there, those jars, you could tell they were very thick glassed jars, are fairly expensive. Also in the video towards the end, you might have noticed there were some smaller ones that had a little bit of metal and some paned glass around them. They were kind of ornate. Those might even be less expensive. And there are definitely some ways to find different ones. I was on some websites earlier today, and I really don't want to name those websites, but there were some that have lots of different, if you Google cloches or hot caps, you'll find very affordable ones that maybe are made out of plastic or glass or maybe even a fabric material. I've seen domes made out of this fabric material, like the row cover fabric, that can be easily removed and just taken on off for a single or individual plants. So look out there and you'll find them. You'll find the very expensive ones and you'll find cheaper ones.
And do you have any tips on if people are wanting to try using those?
The glass cloches?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just there's a little bit more management involved with those because they don't vent. They're very heavy, very thick. They will give you some protection, but you have to think about venting them on bright days because it can get way too hot in there for those.
All right, and just a couple more questions here. So another one, wondering about places to buy cold frames. So we can't recommend specific retailers for buying a cold frame, but where in general, what kinds of places could you look if you were trying to buy one?
Yeah, so you can find potentially at garden centers, or at least ask at the garden centers, what type of frost protection material do you have here? Do you have cold frames? You can definitely, again, Google cold frames for sale. You will find lots of ones. The one that I built there with the old pallet material and the decking lumber is something you can very easily do. But if you don't want to go that route, you'll find ones that are much nicer than that are made out of polycarbonate material and metal frames. Again, they're out there. Several vendors sell those. And if you Google that, you'll find them.
Okay, and our last question here, and this is a really good question. So if you are using a cold frame or even a greenhouse or a high tunnel or something, what should you do about irrigation since they're closed off from the rain?
That's a great question. So you're gonna, I don't know if you noticed, if you all were looking at the first video we did with Jim Hankins, the hooped row covers, there was an irrigation line that ran right down the middle of that bed. And in fact, Jim said, don't poke a hole in my irrigation line with a staple. So that's one way to have that hooked up, is to have some type of drip irrigation, whether it's a soaker hose or a drip irrigation tape material like that was, or even the ability to uncover and water. The nice thing about a lot of the row covers and the cloches or hot caps is that because they're somewhat enclosed, they are reducing the amount of soil evaporation, moisture evaporation that's taking place. So it doesn't need as much water, but definitely you need to think about irrigation during when you're covered. The picture here with the high tunnels that have the polyethylene covers that rainwater doesn't get through, we have to irrigate everything in there. So it's just another part of the whole thing. You don't get away from not irrigating with these. You really have to irrigate.
And one more question just along those same lines. What do you do about pollinators also if you're growing in a cold frame or a high tunnel?
Sure. So in the high tunnels, which you see behind us, which has got, I mean, you see in that picture there, you'll see that there's vents on the sides of these structures that allows for cooling and ventilation. It also allows for pollinators to get in if need be. And even potentially some natural pollinators will take up residence inside a structure that large. In a lot of enclosed greenhouses, we actually, when we work with hydroponic tomatoes, we bring in bumblebee hives for pollination. They actually keep them in the greenhouse. But in the row cover situation or the cold frames, you do need to ventilate. I think Jim Hankins mentioned that when the blossoms and the flowers started appearing on those eggplants, that was his reminder to start taking those row covers off so that they could be pollinated properly by the insects that would do that. But even just like I mentioned, if you can remove the covers or open them up for an extended period of time during the day, maybe from 9 in the morning once it's warming up some to 2 in the afternoon, to let that pollination occur. Then you can cover them back up if you wanted to.
Perfect. That was super helpful, Chris. I'm going to add a giant roll of Remay to my holiday wish list. We hope that this has been helpful to all of you. If you are interested in growing later into the fall or winter, we did have Galen Johnson, who's the extension agent in Hampton, do a really good one of these Get Gardening videos on how to keep growing longer. So she talks about what kinds of crops you can think about growing. And she also shows some of her containers, how she wraps them to make sure they are protected from the cold. So I'll put the link to that and some of the other resources that Chris mentioned in the description on this video. And then next week at 2, we're going to have the kind of finale in this series, talking a little bit about propagating succulents in indoor gardening. And then if you want to continue your gardening journey, how you can become a master gardener or reach out to the program for help. So thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you again, Chris.
You're welcome.